Hey everybody. Going to There's so much going on right now with President Trump and the court case from the district judge James Boasberg, who tried to have him stop the deportation of about 250, 230 um, designated terrorists from a Venezuelan gang called Tren de Agua. And so the district judge put a national injunction to stop that deportation effort. And so there's a big debate about whether or not a district judge has the authority to intervene and stop the president, who is the power vested in the executive branch, from conducting foreign policy or conducting immigration policy. So the media is kind of going crazy with it and saying that this is a constitutional crisis, but there is a good amount of political maneuvering and gesturing and posturing for public opinion that's not supported by the Constitution or the law. So I'm just going to kind of go through a little bit the separation of powers, what each branch does, and that will kind of set up what we're seeing happening in government and the consistent problems that we're seeing. Um, and it seems to be with one party or one political persuasion against another, but we see it in both. We see it in both parties, maybe not to the same extent, but we do see this kind of overreach that is happening between the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the executive. So we'll get started, and we'll try to keep this video length tight. So I put up just on the screen. You can kind of see the different three branches of government in the U.S. government. It's the executive branch. Um, the power of the executive branch is solely vested in the president. So uh, even though there's Department of Justice, there's the Secretary of State, the State Department, the Department of Agriculture, all of those different departments, all of those entities are actually exercising the power of the president, and so they are answerable to the president. And when the Constitution was created, none of these departments existed. They were all created by Congress, and so when the United States was created, he had four advisors that were put into the Constitution. So that's the Secretary of State, the Vice President, who is also the President of the Senate, the Secretary of War, which we now call the Secretary of Defense, and the Attorney General. So they were individual advisors, not departments. And so you can see that over the 200 plus years, bureaucracy has been created by Congress, and what we have been seeing with government, particularly in the executive branch, is that the power of the presidency is being diluted by these agencies that are developing their own independence. And so what we have to do is look at Congress and what they've been doing. And I think it's been, you could say and argue that it's intentional to dilute the power of the presidency or the office of the presidency by creating these numerous agencies. And so uh, the three branches are not functioning as was originally intended. So again, the executive branch is the power of that branch is solely vested in the president. Then we move to the legislative branch, which has the House of Representatives and the Senate. Their main functions for the House is to initiate and appropriate spending, and make laws. One of the things we're seeing with with the House of Representatives and the Senate and Congress in general is that they are no longer making laws. The lobbyists, these law firms that have their specific agendas about different subjects, are actually making the laws, writing up the laws, and giving them to congressional members to then sell and promote the law for passage. And so that's kind of an abdication of the the role of Congress. And so that's kind of one of the things we've seen, and I would say this has probably been 30 to 50 years where this has been going on, with the lobbying firms starting to kind of take the lead and tell the politicians what to do and what to say. And so that's where you start to see these big bills being brought to vote that no one has read. And the reason they haven't read it is because they had no involvement in the crafting of these laws, right? So again, that's a problem that we're seeing. In the third branch, we have the judicial branch, and their job that's the Supreme Court, that's the Court of Appeals or the circuit courts, and then that's the lower level, which is the district courts, which have specific jurisdictions across the country. What we've been seeing with the judicial branch is that again, Congress has been they have the in the Senate they have the advise and consent statute, and that has turned in many ways into a block on who can enter and be appointed. So what we've seen with specifically at the Supreme Court level, we've seen that certain nominees for the Supreme Court, if they were ultra conservative or considered that way, end up being attacked in the appointment process. So Clarence Thomas is an example. Kavanaugh recently is an example. And then Judge Robert Bork back in the 80s was another example of conservative judges that were kind of savaged. In some cases, in Kavanaugh and Clarence Thomas's case, they made it through, but their reputations were specifically damaged. In the other case, on the other party, you would say Merrick Garland was a nominee for Barack Obama to be a Supreme Court justice, and Mitch McConnell, as head of the Senate at the time, or a Senate Majority Leader, chose not to even take up the nomination and just wait until the presidential election, which was later that year, to decide. And then that turned out to flip, and President Trump was able to appoint a conservative judge instead of President Obama being able to appoint a liberal judge. So the judicial branch is also kind of, again, not being functioning the way it should. So there's that ideological problem that we're seeing where there is a push to make moderate to liberal judges what has been pushed through, as opposed to conservative or originalist judges who kind of interpret the Constitution in its original form. What we've also been seeing and hearing about is a thing called judicial activism, and that is when the judicial branch, their function is to interpret the law and apply the law and uphold the Constitution. But there are been many cases where ideologically driven judges have ended up making law. Again, Congress abdicating its responsibility and letting the courts make law. An example of that was Roe v. Wade. An example of that was the Prop 8 case in California that went to the Supreme Court and was affirmed by the Supreme Court, which made gay marriage legal nationwide. It's never for the Roe v. Wade case or for the Prop 8 case. It was never about whether or not what they decided on, was it correct or not. It's more that the process was not the right process. So in the Roe v. Wade situation, it's something that the states should have handled. If the U.S. Congress wanted to make a law making abortion legal for the nation, they had the power to do that. But politically, it was a really fraught issue, and so they just punted it and left it to the courts to handle. And I think that is why. And if the U.S. Congress wasn't going to handle it, then it's left for each state to decide how they wanted to handle that particular issue. So when the U.S. Federal Supreme Court made that law or affirmed that law and made it legal for the entire nation, it set it up for it to be reversed as precedent, which just happened a few years ago in the first Trump administration. So even though you can debate whether or not Roe v. Wade is correct law, the point is it should have been either handled by the states, or the U.S. Congress should have made a law, and was the proper way. And I think that you'll see that either stay with the states, or going forward they'll make a law about it. The same thing with the gay marriage case as well. So all of this is to say that over the last 40, 50 years, the three branches are not working the way that they should. And I think Congress has been intentionally, um, because of its appointment powers through advising consent, because of its power of the purse, they have been influencing both branches, the executive branch and the judicial branch. And what has happened is in the executive branch, you've created this large bureaucracy that has been largely protected from the influence of the president. So the problem with that is when a president is elected, he's elected by the people. The entire nation votes to have a president come in, and he runs on a platform, he or she runs on a platform of what they want to get done. And then when they get to office, the bureaucracy that technically reports to him and is technically exercising his vested power as president, they are not they don't feel obligated to fulfill what the president wants. And so these presidents are here for one term, 4 years, or two terms, 8 years maximum. And these bureaucrats are there for decades. And so what ends up happening is you now have the entire or most of the executive branch, independent of the influence of the president, and his appointees to run those organizations are literally figureheads and can be undermined or disobeyed, really, in many cases. And so, what we're seeing with President Trump, both in his first term and now in his second term, is him trying to fix things back to how they were originally intended, which is a problem for Washington, D.C. as a whole, because the entire region has been built around the economy and the business of government. So, when you have a large bureaucracy, well, those people live and have homes and have careers and make money, and they use the power of their offices and positions to monetize themselves in other ways. And so when the president is starting to cut departments and fire government workers, that has impacts in the economy, in the local economy. It also has the impact of affecting an entire class of people, which is the social class and the political class that has developed around Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of resistance to that, but the president has the authority to organize the executive branch as he sees fit. It's just that it's gotten so bloated and enlarged, and locked in, where they're largely unaccountable in many ways. Um, the bureaucracy feels that it can fight back against a duly elected president. So that this is unsustainable, and we are seeing the confrontation of that happening. One of the things that you keep hearing is that the Department of Justice is an independent um, agency. It isn't. The Attorney General, the president, is the chief law enforcement officer of the country. So it's his job to enforce the law, and he should work with the Attorney General to do that. Yes, there are some optics to how you go about prosecuting criminal behavior and things of that nature. So there should be some sensitivity to not targeting political enemies and things like that. But there's a point where, um, when you hand over total independence to some of these executive agencies, you're essentially giving power to those agencies to be independent and run their own government policy, which is unelected, and they aren't answerable to anyone. What we're seeing with this current judge is he is a district judge in the District of Columbia, and his jurisdiction does not cover the foreign policy and the powers of the president. And so he shouldn't have been able to, block this deportation. And that's what the executive branch is arguing right now. But what has happened over the last 40 years is that nationwide injunctions from the district courts have been commonly put in. And so that's a regular practice at this point that has been allowed to metastasize. And so it's going to have to go up to the Supreme Court eventually, and they're going to have to rule that a district court cannot have these nationwide injunctions because they don't have they don't have the authority and they don't represent the jurisdiction to do that. But these things take time, and so what what we're seeing with the courts is a concept called lawfare, where the legal process that it takes to get to a final answer on what is correct or what is wrong, it takes a number of years, and that process can ultimately, effectively, or essentially shut down policies that people don't like, that they don't want to see through. So, perfect example, and I'll show you two examples on both sides. On one case, President Trump, wanted to make the wall, and he was having trouble getting funding from separate bill from Congress to build a wall, but there was already money that had been appropriated for the Department of Defense, and he turned and used that money to build a wall. Well, that went to court. A district judge blocked that, and they had to go through the process of going to the Court of Appeals, and then to the Supreme Court. And it was ultimately determined that the president had the authority to reappropriate or appropriate those funds to build a wall, even though it wasn't specifically originally built for that. And so then on the other hand, you have President Obama. He made a policy where, uh, unaccompanied minors were able to come into the U.S. and be given work authorizations. They call that DACA, and then the parents of those children were called. They had a policy called DAPA, and that was put through in 2012, and it was unconstitutional. And the courts, the lawyers who worked for the Obama administration knew that it was likely unconstitutional when they did it, but they also knew that the process was going to be a long process. And so they put that through in 2012, and it goes through the first court and it might have been affirmed. It gets to the Court of Appeals and eventually is ruled unlawful. But by that time, that law or that policy has been put in place for 7 or 8 or 9 years. And it then becomes very difficult to unwind or unpack that policy. So what we are seeing with government in general is this manipulation of the courts, in ways that are not legal, and in ways that the lawyers know on either side of an issue what's legal and what's not legal, but the process has to play out. And so media narratives are able to be created, selling that the president doesn't have the authority to do this and he's acting as a dictator, which is not true. And so this kind of confrontation is coming to a head as government has to decide, or has to be decided by some actor. Are things going to revert back to the original intent of the Constitution, the separation of powers, and how the branches are originally supposed to work, or are we going to get to a point where the presidency itself is no longer a functional position? And we're getting close to that point where if a president is of a certain ideological background, that he may not be able to function, and that is not at all what the founding fathers intended. And again, I think what we're seeing here is the last days of kind of a system that has been in place for many decades, and it's fighting and resisting change, and that's not going to necessarily stand. So I think this confrontation we're seeing are going to continue to play out. I think that the Supreme Court is really going to be active in establishing the proper precedents for how the branches are supposed to work together, and what they're not supposed to be doing. But I think you're going to have to see that there's going to be some changes to the executive branch. There's going to be some changes to how Congress conducts its business. And I think there's going to be changes to how the judiciary branch has been doing its job too. So you may see there have to be some kind of uh, you know oversight of judges and their rulings, because what we've been finding is, since critical race theory has been spread through the elite legal community, or the elite, law schools, uh, the judges have brought their own politics to interpretation of the Constitution. And that is not what the founders intended. That was never what was intended with the judiciary. But what it does is it effectively causes causes the system to be gummed up when there are policies that the political class doesn't want to see put through. That's why we can't resolve immigration. That's why we can't resolve um, the entitlement programs and overruns in that department. That's why we can't seem to stop the constant growth of the military industrial complex. There's so many different issues that are unresolved because um, uh, the court system, the bureaucracy, the legislative branch, all of them are functioning in political ways and not in line with their actual true function. So I hope that this was informative. These issues will continue to come up, and we'll address them more. But I just wanted to touch a little bit on some of these issues and put some background on them. Have a good day.